All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to this conversation. So this event is part of a series. Tolerance Means Dialogue, a series that engages in conversation about difficult topics to create mutual understanding and tolerance in our diverse and pluralistic society. The title of this event is Religious Liberty or Unjust Discrimination? Is Peaceful Coexistence Possible in the Culture Wars? You're probably aware of a lot of this background already. In recent years, our society has witnessed a number of conflicts between claims of civil rights and claims of religious freedom. I teach in the law school. Last year, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Masterpiece Cake Shop about whether a Christian cake maker could refuse to make a wedding cake for a gay couple's wedding. That's just one case, of course. There are so many others. One striking case is happening now in Michigan, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. The issue whether Catholic Charities has to place children, adoptive children, with gay couples. Gay couples can go to other providers. Catholic Charities doesn't have a monopoly, but gay couples are still being turned away by Catholic Charities. How do we resolve these kinds of disputes, right? What resolution treats both sides with the kindness and respect they deserve? That particular case is a pretty messy one, both factually and legally. There's a wrestling match inside the case between the Michigan legislature and the Attorney General's office over who gets to set policy. But this case and countless others raise these questions about tolerance, right? What's the tolerant thing to do? What do we mean by tolerance? Is tolerance something, the thing, that we should be advancing? And if so, how do we go about advancing? These four speakers are going to address these questions and others. I'll introduce our two faculty speakers first, and then I'll introduce our two student speakers. Our student speakers contributed winning essays on the theme of tolerance. They're each awarded a $750 scholarship. Law school student Ben Van Bar will be recognized for his essay, Tolerance Means Having the Courage to Live Alongside Someone Different Than You. An honors student, Laura Lynch, will be recognized for her essay, Tolerance Means Taking a Few Steps Back to Move Forward. With that, I'll introduce the speakers. John Corvino is Dean of the Irvin D. Reid Honors College and Professor of Philosophy here at Wayne State University. Corvino's research focuses mainly on issues relating to sexuality and marriage. He's the author of, or co-author of 3 books from Oxford University Press, Debating Same-Sex Marriage, What's Wrong with Homosexuality, and most recently, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. Robin Fretwell Wilson is the Roger and Stephanie Jocelyn Professor of Law at the University of Illinois College of Law. She's the author of 11 books. It's not a contest, people. Relating to children, marriage, sexuality, and religion. Ben Van Bar is a second-year law student at Wayne Law who's passionate about public interest work. He's the president of a legal conference on human trafficking at the law school and worked for a congressional oversight committee in Washington, D.C. this summer. And again, Ben's going to be recognized for his essay, Tolerance Means Having the Courage to Live Alongside Someone Different Than You. Laura Lynch is currently a freshman undergraduate student here at Wayne, studying political science and peace and conflict studies. Originally from Royal Oak, she lives on campus here in Detroit, and she will be recognized for her essay, Tolerance Means Taking a Few Steps Back to Move Forward. One final alert that relates to this slide. We are pleased that this event is being live streamed on social media. There'll be a social media prize, a $250 check that I understand Professor Wilson will be signing in front of our very eyes at the end of this. It's only for students, but if you find yourself engaged in social media, you might be pleasantly rewarded at the end of this. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, John Corvino.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let me start by saying, after all I do to encourage my students to put their phones away, you go and do this with $250. So thank you about that. But seriously, do participate in this. And we appreciate Robin Fretwell Wilson for coming here to Wayne State and for all that she does to promote better dialogue and better tolerance. I want to congratulate our two student winners. I'm very excited by their essays, but I also want to congratulate all the students who submitted essays, because there really were quite a few very good essays, and the more we think about these things, the more we talk about these things, the better off we are. I only have about 10 minutes, which is really hard for a philosophy professor, so I'm going to try to jump right in, and I'm going to aim to cover 3 quick things. First, and this way you don't have to stretch your neck, Chris. I'm just going to turn that so you can see it there. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the marriage equality battle and why, in some sense, that battle is not fully over. Second, I'm going to talk about some of these wedding provider cases, and I'm going to focus on cake cases, including the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that Professor Lund mentioned. And then third, I'm going to talk a little bit about social science and some data we have from social science about how polarization is affecting our society. And I'll conclude with some suggestions on how we might do better. Now, the standard narrative on marriage is that the marriage battle is over and my people won. And won not just because in 2015 the Supreme Court decided Obergefell v. Hodges, allowing same-sex couples to marry across the United States, but also in the sense that public opinion on marriage has changed fairly rapidly in recent decades in the direction of approval of marriage for same-sex couples. And if you look at Gallup polling on this issue, Gallup didn't start polling on the marriage issue until 1996, and in 1996, only 27% of Americans approved of marriage for same-sex couples. Most recently, 63%, that's down a little bit last year from 67%, but you can see the trend line. But the trend line does not tell the whole story, because it puts everyone together, and of course we live in a diverse nation. For those of us who were around for some of this history from 1996 to today, we experienced it a little bit differently. So in 2004, here is a map where all of the states that allow same-sex couples to marry are colored in red. And by all of the states, I mean Massachusetts. That's just 15 years ago, which, if you're a college student, 15 years may seem like a long time. I've been at Wayne State for 21 years, so 15 years, that's just barely any time at all. But that's 2004. Here's 9 years later. A little bit of change in the map. You've got some stuff in the Northeast, you've got some stuff on the West Coast, you have Minnesota and Iowa. Iowa? Yeah, Iowa. But not a lot of change in 9 years, and now, watch 2 years later, bam. Yes, that was my reaction, and that was the reaction of many folks, but not all folks. And particularly not folks in some of the states that were still colored in white just a couple years before, who experienced this change as very jarring. And it's important to remember that while marriage is a legal institution, and that's an important aspect of what marriage is, it's more than just that. It's also a social institution. It's also a personal commitment. And all of these different aspects of marriage are important. It's one thing for the state to allow you to marry. It's another thing for your family to show up at your wedding and be happy for you. That's also an important aspect of what marriage is, and it's also one of the reasons why, for many individuals, for many couples, for many families, this continues to be an issue. And while legally we may feel that the marriage issue is settled, there are other aspects of the law where the marriage battle is played out to some extent, particularly with respect to services provided for weddings, which brings me to my second point. You may have heard about some of the cases involving wedding providers who refuse to do wedding services for same-sex couples. Perhaps the best-known case right now is that of Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop. In 2012, a gay couple, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, walk into Masterpiece Cake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado, start flipping through a catalog of cake designs, some pictures of cakes that baker Jack Phillips had done before. Jack Phillips approaches the two men and says, "Welcome to my shop, how can I help you?" And they explain that they want a cake for their wedding celebration. Now, and at the time, 2012, marriage was not yet legal for same-sex couples in Colorado. They were going to get married in Massachusetts, I believe, come back home to Colorado to celebrate their wedding with family and friends afterwards. Jack Phillips explained, politely, that he did not support same-sex marriage. This was a bridge too far for him. He could not sell them a cake for their wedding, but he'd be happy to sell them other things in the store, cookies, cupcakes, birthday cakes, things like that. The couple left the store. The whole interaction between them was under 2 minutes. The couple filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which determined that Jack Phillips was liable for sexual orientation discrimination. Colorado prohibits discrimination in public accommodations on, among other characteristics, sexual orientation. That case then worked its way up through Colorado courts, which agreed with the commission, and then found itself in front of the US Supreme Court, which in June of 2018 decided in Phillips' favor, but on very narrow sort of grounds that don't really tell us what other cases like this in the future will hold. Because what they said was, look, maybe Jack Phillips has a free speech and a freedom of religion right to refuse to sell cakes to same-sex couples. Maybe he doesn't, but you know, we don't even need to go there because this particular commission didn't give him a fair hearing. They said some things during the hearing that suggested that they were disparaging Jack Phillips' religion, and if he didn't get a fair hearing, that's a violation of his free exercise rights, his constitutional rights to the free exercise of religion. And so in this particular case, we need to decide in Phillips' favor, but we leave until later on the bigger questions, the harder questions of whether he might have this kind of right. Some people describe the case as a masterpiece of dodging the hard questions by the Supreme Court. Right around the same time that the Colorado Commission had decided Jack Phillips' case, a customer named William Jack, I know, very confusing, too many Jacks. A customer named William Jack walks into a bakery called Azucar Bakery in Colorado, requests not a God Hates Gays cake, although that was how it was reported very often in the news, but a Bible-shaped cake where on the one hand it says on the one side it says homosexuality is a detestable sin, Leviticus 18:22, and then on the other side, one side says Leviticus 18:22, homosexuality is a detestable sin. And, do you remember what the other side? I don't remember what the other side said. In any case, that's the relevant part. It's a paraphrase, by the way. The Leviticus 18:22 is, man shall not lie with man as with woman, it is an abomination unto God. That's a lot to write on a cake. So he paraphrases. In any case, the baker in that case, Marjorie Silva, says, no, I can't make that cake for you, although I'm happy to sell you a Bible-shaped cake. I'm happy to give you an icing bag so you can write what you want on the cake. Now, clearly, William Jack was trying to make a point here. If Jack Phillips cannot refuse to make a cake because of his moral and religious beliefs, why should Marjorie Silva be able to refuse to make a cake because of her moral and religious beliefs? It seems like those cases ought to be treated the same. And in the Supreme Court's decision on Masterpiece Cake Shop, one of the things that Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, brought out is that there seemed to be inconsistency with how the commission treated the Jack Phillips case versus how they treated the various cases involving customer William Jack. Now, my own view is that these cases were not treated inconsistently because there's a very important difference between the cases. Marjorie Silva refused to sell a particular design to William Jack, but she was happy to provide him with a Bible-shaped cake because that's something she would provide to any other customer. Jack Phillips, by contrast, refused to sell Charlie Craig and David Mullins any cake for their wedding. It's one thing to say that, look, this particular design, this particular message, this particular writing is not something I want to do. It's another thing to say, I will not sell you any cake for this particular event, which makes an important difference between the two cases. But the other point I want to make is that if, in a future case like this, we were to side with Jack Phillips and say, no, he can refuse on the basis of his moral and religious beliefs, it would be very hard to restrict that to objections to same-sex marriage. Because we could imagine another baker who has religious objections to interracial marriage. Indeed, the history of civil rights cases includes many cases where people cited moral and religious convictions to oppose interracial marriage, to oppose integration of the races. And if Jack Phillips can say, on the basis of my moral and religious beliefs, I don't want to create a cake that supports the message of this marriage, another baker could do so on the basis of opposition to interracial marriage. And then once you allow that step, it's hard to know how we would even contain it to weddings. You could imagine a baker who said, look, birthday cakes send a message. They send the message that your life is worth celebrating. Well, if you're a gay person, I don't think your life is worth celebrating. I think that gay lives don't matter. I don't want to create a cake sending that message. I'll sell you cookies and other things in the store, but that for me is a bridge too far. And you're going to say, that's just silly. Well, actually, we do have a case involving a baker refusing to sell a birthday cake. In 2016, not far from here, in Toledo, Ohio, a customer went into a bakery owned by LaGresha Pfizer Brown, ordered a birthday cake. Afterwards, Pfizer Brown went on the customer's Facebook page, P.S., who does that? Went on the customer's Facebook page, noticed that the customer was in a same-sex relationship and sent her a text and said, I'm sorry, Candace, I'm sorry, I just realized you're in a same-sex relationship and we do not do cakes for same-sex weddings or parties. I'm so sorry, I wasn't aware of this exactly until I saw your page. Take care, smiley face. Now, this case was never litigated. Most of what we have, what we know about this case, we know from news reports, including this, which I assume is a screenshot of the text. My own view is if you use this font for texting, you deserve to lose in court, but it never went to court. That's just my opinion. But my point is that once we go down this road where we say that businesses open to the public can start refusing to cooperate in the celebration of things that violate their moral and religious convictions, we start down a slippery slope that really could lead to the obliteration, in effect, of public accommodation law. And you might say, look, why do you get so worked up about cakes and flowers and other stuff? And the point I want to finish this section with is that it's not just about cakes and flowers. I mean, I don't want to diminish the feelings of people who are looking through a catalog of beautiful cakes and then are told, oh yeah, I sell those to other customers, but those are not for you. I mean, that's pretty humiliating. That's bad enough. But we also have cases of discrimination in things like funeral services. We also have discrimination in housing and jobs and so on. Those are the really important areas, and once we start making a dent in anti-discrimination law, I worry about how those kinds of things eventually will be affected. Okay, final point, social science. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. I'm going to start with some bad news from social science. 2013, Yale law professor Dan Kahan does a study trying to determine the effect of political polarization on people's decision-making ability. So he gets a group of subjects together, and first he gives them all a questionnaire to determine two things. One, where they fall on the political spectrum. Are they conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats? Where are they on the whole red state, blue state thing? The other thing he does is he gives them some questions to determine how good they are at math. Assigns them what he calls a numeracy score. Then he divides them into separate groups. And to half of the subjects, he gives a study about a new skin cream. This many people were given this skin cream in order to treat their rash. 223 of patients who used the skin cream, their rash got better. 75, their rash got worse. 107 who didn't use the skin cream, the rash got better. 21, the rash got worse. Is it better or worse for people to use the skin cream? Now, if you're not very good at math, or if you're like me and you really don't care, you might look at that and say, oh, 223 is a big number. Oh, it's better to use the skin cream. In fact, that's the wrong answer. You have to do ratios. You have to do a little bit of math. What he found is that the better people were at math, the more likely they were to get the right answer. And also, not surprisingly, whether they were conservative Republicans or liberal Democrats made absolutely no difference to the likelihood of their getting the right answer. You can see this on this graph. And by the way, for half of them, he flipped the numbers in terms of what gets better, what gets worse. The red lines are for Republicans, the blue lines are for Democrats. As you go further to the right, you're better at math. Likelihood of getting the right answer increases the better you are at math. Then he gives the exact same numbers to the other half of the people, except instead of a study on skin cream, it's about a gun control law. We introduced the gun control law in these cities. In this many cities, gun violence got better. In this many cities, gun violence got worse, et cetera and so forth, but the exact same numbers. So, you know where we're going with this. Of course, whether the answer conformed with people's pre-existing views about whether gun control laws are good or bad very much influenced the likelihood of their getting the right answer. But the worst part is that being better at math seemed to make absolutely no difference to people's likelihood of getting the right answer. Moral of the story, political polarization makes us bad at math. The real moral of the story is that political polarization makes it harder for us to come together and improve the world, face the challenges that we need to face together. I sometimes use the analogy of living in a house with a thermostat. I know thermostats don't look like this anymore. People have Nest thermostats and things like that. Now, but we're at that time of year, people are turning their thermostat on. And you may have arguments in your house about when to turn on the thermostat, what to set the thermostat at. Suppose you like to set your thermostat at 75 and I like to set mine at 65. Well, fine, you have your house, I have my house. Now suppose we all share the same house. Now we've got a challenge, now we've got a problem. I tend to think of these culture war issues as issues involving our house, the world we have to share together. The bad news from social science is that our polarization is making it harder for us to solve those issues. The good news is that if we can actually come together, if we can talk together, if we can reason together, we are more likely to use reason and find the right answer as opposed to just going with our initial gut instincts. I have some other suggestions about how we might do better, but I realize I'm gone over my time considerably, so I'm going to pass this over to Robin. Thank you very much.
While we're changing up, I should say thanks to Avery for taking care of the social media. I pulled out of my, credit card thing on the back of my phone, the check that I am going to write to somebody at the end of this event. So I see a couple people on their phone. I'm hoping you're tweeting, because I'd love to write the check to you. And we have gotten one question or two already, but please, send them our way. It's hard not to have a lot of questions after John's riveting discussion. Also wanted to thank Kevin. Thank you for all the work that you've done on the event. Julius, thanks for making it all look good, and to the team that's videotaping. So I'm Robin Wilson. I want to pick up with where John left off. And I want to thank Chris, who's been a longtime colleague in law and religion. Thank you. Chris should be giving these talks as well, so we'll have to work on that over time. But in any event, I want to pick up where John left off and talk about whether we have a public square that we can share, because that's really the question. And, you know, the culture war often, you know, presents as just a straight up clash. So if you have this value, you can't have that value. If you have this value or this set of folks that you want to protect, like LGBT folks, then somehow necessarily religious folks lose. Now, I just completely reject that. I think it's wrong. I think it has polarized our nation. I think it has made us less good people in ways that are deeply unfortunate. And one of the things that I love most about these dialogues is the kind of insights that Laura and Ben add. Like, if we, wait till you hear them, okay? If we could distill their insights and yours and any of the essayists that submitted essays into like a little tiny vial and like ship it around to all the adults that are in charge, we would actually do a lot better as a nation, and you'll see that in just a moment. I'm going to try to go up to the 60,000 foot level and talk about how we can in fact construct a public square that is big enough for all of us. That's not a winner take all or a zero-sum game. So this is the culture war today. You recognize it, just one train wreck after another, after another, after another. And we're told that it only can proceed that way. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's not right. Instead, what I think has to happen is that we need to protect the civil rights of multiple groups of people in the exact same law. And that it's like puzzle pieces, civil rights. They can be fit together, but we have to take care in the law to figure out what some unintended consequences or consequences we might project from protecting one set of folks means for others, and then we need to write sophisticated laws. Most of the time, we can avoid straight up collisions between people, but we need to actually try to write laws that share the public square deliberately and take people out of these collision points. So that's the basic thrust. Now, when we look at this map, I should have just done red and blue, but I like to do red and bumpy or just bumpy and gray. But look, all the bumpy places on this map are places that protect the full LGBT community from discrimination. Now think about that for a second. They say the fact that you are gay or trans shouldn't matter to whether you're at this university or in this very public space. They say that the fact that you're gay or trans shouldn't matter to whether you get a job or have a place to live. Now, in my view, having worked with lawmakers in Utah, which did this sort of civil rights complementarity, okay, those folks are in the West, they believe in like the American dream and freedom and, you know, very strong sense of freedom and space. In their minds, that is the American dream, that we have the ability to work and live and be treated completely on the merits and not sort of discriminated against for irrelevant characteristics. So that's sort of the map. Notice where you guys are, you're flat, right? There are no protections across the full state for the LGBT community. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't protections in the state. There'll be municipalities that will protect people. But even that's a problem in the sense that that variability at the state level is actually a challenge for employers because then they're navigating multiple sets of laws across the same locality. That's true, I'll show you in a second, in the Midwest too. Then we have a Reid against this. All these protections, Chris will recognize this map because these are basically state constitutional protections for religious burdens. And state laws called Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, and you're probably the leading expert on these maps, so if it's out of date, don't say anything. It might be slightly out of date, but we're trying to resolve every conflict about the public square and about the lives of people with laws that are framed in discrimination or framed in like religious people win. Now, the laws don't actually read that way. They say if you're burdened by a law and it uniquely burdens you as a religious person substantially, then the burden will shift to the government to explain why it has a compelling interest in no less restrictive means. Did I get that right? Okay. And that's really tough here, because go to the cases that John described about the cake, right? You know, to some extent, whether you can walk in to the bakery and be served, it's a question of citizenship. It's literally a question of acceptance in society. Now, it's hard to posit a less restrictive means, if that's what anti-discrimination law means, then you're able to walk in and be served. I've suggested in my work that there may be other ways to make sure that there's not an, quote, unintended effect on religious providers, the florist, the baker, the seamstress, whoever, which would be to try to solve the problem inside of the business for them so that if they feel that they can't make the cake or do whatever, somebody else will be able to do that service for them. So you're trying to have it both ways. That's sort of my general approach to things. It may not be a perfect answer, we can talk about that. But the point being that these laws are trying in broad brushstrokes to solve things that are very granular. And I think in many ways they convince us that we don't need to have the hard conversation about how we live together. Now the Midwest, I'm sort of focused on because I teach at the University of Illinois. If you go around the Midwest and stop there, you'll see that in every single state, we have lots of gay people and we have lots of very religious people. So you can ignore the red-blue divide on the map about whether we protect the full LGBT community or not. We all live together. We're all living together. So it's incumbent upon us to write a law that actually recognizes that. Now in a new book, I'll show you a cover of it in a few minutes, but a new book, I show that every single anti-discrimination law in the United States that protects people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, they were all written before marriage came on the scene. So they could not have thought through questions like the baker and whether people have specific religious protections around marriage qua marriage. And so these blue state laws don't give robust answers either. And certainly the red states don't. They just, are not providing protections. Now, just as I said in a municipality, that's an issue. When you have municipal protections that are different across the state, it's an issue for business. This is an issue for business in the Midwest too, because you have companies like Eli Lilly or Allstate or Salesforce that are straddling, in effect, very different bodies of employment law. And so it becomes anti-competitive, in my view, for a region to have that much variability, and I think these companies may believe that too. Now, Utah, as I said, meshed these civil rights, and so this is a picture that is from 2015 of a law that came at the time from the single most conservative state in America politically. They're not now because they've broken with Trump, maybe to their credit, but in any event, they're not now the single most conservative state in America politically. Second most religious state in America at the time, second only to Mississippi in one metric. And yet they gave more protections to the full LGBT community than that community expressly had in state law in New York. Now pause for a second, get that, take that in. Utah, the single most politically conservative state in America, second most religious, gave more protections to the full LGBT community than that community had in New York. And this is a chart. I'll show you a web page where you obviously can't see the details, but the most important is this line. Look at the line with the little state that looks kind of squarish, that's Utah. It gave more rights on both sides of the ledger to the full LGBT community than that community had in other, quote, blue states, and more protections around marriage, faith, and sexuality to churches and religious groups than those groups had in other states. Okay, including, in another chart I show on this webpage, including states like Alabama that were like, no way in hell are we having same-sex marriage. Well, guess what? Utah embraced LGBT rights and they have more protections for people of faith than Alabama. It's a two-way street. Both sides win under this civil rights complementarity approach. Now I want to spend a second, and I know I'm running out of time too, so hard for me to say anything to John. But I want to spend a second on adoption and foster care, because you realize that the culture war has shifted from same-sex marriage to adoption, and that Michigan is ground zero for that culture war right now. Now, this is one of the places I'm going to disclose something about myself because I think it's really relevant. I'm an adopted child. I actually think, I'll tell you a little bit about my parents. They both are first generation. My dad didn't even finish college. He grew up in the Appalachia. His parents had died when he was very young. He went in the military. He was a welder. He was a very rough-hewn man. And my mom came from a farming family as well, was in the Air Force and met my father that way and so forth. So my father was a very rough-hewn man, smart man, but just didn't have the refinement. Now, I tell you that because if he and my mom had walked into an adoption agency and said, we want to adopt a child, that's already a mountain to climb when I was born, because it was in effect saying to the world that you were infertile. Already a mountain to climb. And if you had told him that they weren't the perfect family, he would have said, Alice, we're out of here, and they never would have adopted children. Now, we effectively have that happening with religious adoption agencies in the United States right now. Now, we like to think the only people they tell to get lost or to go off or, go somewhere else are LGBT couples, but that's not true. There's a case out of South Carolina called Miracle Hill, where an evangelical agency told Catholics to get lost, go on to someone else, told a Jewish couple that this was not the right place for them. Now, many people look at that and their culture war impulse, right, because we haven't been talked to, we haven't thought very deliberately about the middle, is that, oh, okay, now we need to close those religious agencies because they're bad, or we'll ask which ones are willing to serve everybody and then close the rest. The problem is that in many states, the religious agencies are carrying like 25% of the load. Now, you can sustain a hit in a place like Boston, where Catholic Charities of Boston did close because they couldn't bring themselves to make placements with same-sex couples. But you cannot sustain it across America. There's no way. And I want to talk about my mom and dad one more time. Because if they were Methodist, Methodists had said to them, hey, we can suggest a great agency for you. That would have mattered to my dad. It would have mattered to my mom, too. And the religious agencies are really good at finding families that, for whatever reason in their heart, they want to take on kids that are a hot mess like my sister and me. And God bless them, right? Thank you. For everybody here who's adopted or thinking about it, thank you, okay? Because we need more families to adopt. And I would suggest to you we need more agencies, including religious agencies. Now, what does that mean? We need to have a structure that opens a space between the religious agencies and families, instead of the money coming from the feds down to the state and the state picking winners and losers and everyone being forced through them. People should be able to direct themselves to the agency that best helps them. If that's an LGBT-friendly agency because that's your jam, great. And if that's a religious agency like Methodist or a Jewish agency or just a secular agency that you think is really great, great. But families for this purpose should be in the driver's seat because they are taking those children on. I'm going to end on that note because we have far better things to talk about, which are our scholarship winners. And I'll just remind you and leave this up if it's okay for you, Laura, so that people can tweet questions there. Thank you very much.
Let's see if I can figure out how to put this back in here. I did it, no worries. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So before I begin, I just wanted to express what an honor it is to be here and to just thank everyone and hopefully raise a round of applause to everyone who put so much work into this event. Events like this and conversations like this are just so important to have, and I'm just so thankful to be here. So, tolerance means taking a few steps back to move forward. I say moving backwards, and I'm sure many of you got chills down your spine due to the implications of this phrase, but let me elaborate first. From the moment I walked into my cushy kindergarten classroom for the first time, I gained fundamental insight into the meaning and practice of tolerance. Looking up at the brightly colored walls, among posters chock full of forgettable, sing-songy phrases about manners, I was first introduced to the Golden Rule. Though the name suggests something highly esteemed, the notion of treating others as you wish to be treated is something seemingly forgotten by the time we learn and soon after employ our first vulgar words. In fact, Americans today live in a society that's educational system creates and instills a worldview that sets us up for intolerance. Just as we learn tolerance through schooling, I believe we learn intolerance. Tolerance, the practice of treating others how you wish to be treated despite their differences, requires an individual to give everyone's views the same respect as their own. The choice to act with respect and patient understanding opens the door to a diversity of dialogue that ultimately strengthens our society as a whole and cultivates the potential for love. Yet, Americans aren't taught that as we move up the ranks in our schooling. In fact, the way we're taught history almost always vices us into looking at situations in terms of us and them, with ourselves taking the position of moral superiority. An example of this pattern lies in how Americans are taught history. We spend many years learning about what the US did, why the US did it, our prosperity, and about our moral goodness. A personal anecdote of mine that I feel displays this quite well was that in my high school AP World History class, the kids were asked to list what they knew about the history of the United States and Africa. For the United States, there was a long list of our greatest achievements and most cherished figures. For Africa, they came up with 3 facts, and one of them was that it was a lame song by Toto. So,
Okay, I thought that
little
was-
to no time is allocated to learning about others and their value, which has the latent effect of teaching us that there's no need to inquire about the rest of the world and its functioning, because we already have the best answers here. This understanding can easily be carried into social issues within the United States as well, when families and communities teach children that the hatred toward and isolation of individuals that are different is somehow acceptable because they're considered inferior. Change at a societal scale in America requires a reformation of the education system that's based on a recognition of our inherent connection to one another as humans, that teaches the merits of diversity by fostering an acceptance of difference in race, sexual orientation, religion, and perspective, and encourages both inquiry and mutual understanding. This is no meager task, but I believe the first step towards such reform starts with individuals. Many of us have understood that acting with tolerance has been an individual choice since our first days of kindergarten, but we must renew our commitment to this choice despite the ease of slipping into the clutches of hate. By taking a few steps back, or even going a few years back in our education, we can foster a new understanding of the world around us. With this intentional decision and an investment in the practice of tolerance, we can melt barriers and open the door to a more peaceful and mutually beneficial society forged on a commitment to respect and equality. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Ben Van Bar. I will echo Laura's thanks for everybody who put this together. So far I've enjoyed the things that I've heard, so I hope everyone else has too. So to jump right into it, in my essay I described tolerance as having the courage to live alongside somebody who's different than you. And when I think about doing that, I think that for a lot of people that is really scary. I know for me, I look at people hunting, and I'm like, you're ripping guts out of things. Like, that's scary to me. But hey, people enjoy it. So when we talk about tolerance, I think that one of the points that a lot of people get stuck on is thinking that tolerance means you have to be passive and apathetic, that you cannot be intolerant of somebody else's intolerance because that violates your code of tolerance. And I don't think that that's true. And a lot of the reason that I think that is when you think about tolerance, I use the analogy of an allergy. I happen to have one, so it's familiar to me. You can develop a tolerance for your allergy by basically exposing yourself to it more and more. And I think that that works the same way when we talk about tolerance in this capacity. If you are tolerating somebody who is intolerant, you are developing a tolerance for their intolerance, which is kind of the opposite of being tolerant in general. On the same note, if you develop a tolerance for the things that are different and scary to you, you will develop that tolerance and they will become less scary and more familiar. So maybe someday I'll go hunting. I think that the hard part about that idea is drawing the boundaries around intolerance itself. I think that it's really easy to extend that to easy labels, convenient labels that you tend to think of as intolerant. So my own example is I grew up very strongly atheist. And I identified religion as a whole, doesn't matter what kind of religion. If you were religious, I assumed that you were intolerant in the worst ways in a capacity that would cause things like war and discrimination. And by doing that, I was basically doing the same thing that I was supposedly opposed to, because I was making this big label about religious people at large, and I was being intolerant of them. From the benefit of philosophy classes, I have since questioned some of my own views, and I recognize some of the weaknesses in that, and I have also gained some exposure to religion and religious people that were far different than the picture that I had in my head. So I've recognized some of the beauty that can come of that, and the charity and the personal benefits that people gain from those kinds of community. So I no longer hold those views, but it's still something, I can remember those feelings. So for me, it's very easy to think about intolerance in that light and think about how I felt towards religious people and translate that into how other people might feel towards other communities. I think that a lot of those dividing lines that we look at, those labels that we place on different groups of people, are not as divisive as they might seem at first glance. So, for example, if you have somebody who, two people work at a factory and they happen to be a different race and there's some hostility between them, but maybe they're both on strike right now, right? Like they're out at the UAW picket line. And it's just weird to me to think about people not seeing all those things that they have in common because of this relatively superficial thing that they think sets them apart. As I have exposed myself to more communities and tried to embrace more acceptance of different communities, I found that a lot of those communities are not quite as unanimous as I might have thought they were. So there are a lot of religious people who have a problem with LGBT couples, and there are also a lot of people who don't and who support them and wish them the best. There are a lot of people who still struggle with racism, and that's not okay. But there are also a lot of people who cherish that diversity and appreciate learning more about different cultures. There are also a lot of people right now who have some hostility towards non-citizens. We hear about that a lot. But there are also a lot of people who see non-citizens and they empathize with the struggles that they came from in their home country and all of the struggles that they've encountered to get here. And they just wish them success. They want them to have a healthy, happy place to live. So, as I mentioned, my description for tolerance is having the courage to live alongside somebody different than you. I think that when we think of it that way, and when we think of developing a tolerance for things, we have a choice to develop tolerance for the things that we feel are different than us, or we can develop a tolerance for intolerance. And I will be choosing the former, and I hope that everybody else will too. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do they
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Do they have microphones? There's a microphone.
Do we
there.
have a microphone? I forgot to ask. Julius, do we happen to have one down there?
Looks like there's one in the back right.
Just kidding.
Do you want to do that?
Yes.
And I'll bring this one over there. You want this one? What?
Sorry, Amelia.
Can you get the microphone and I can bring around anyone who has questions?
We also have questions on Twitter, and we will be awarding a prize, so I'm excited.
And she is writing the check. She didn't
I
make
did.
that
I
up.
just
just saw
literally
her.
wrote
She
that
hasn't put
check.
anybody's name on it yet, but she did write a.
I'm just going to read one of these until we have somebody at the microphone. So Emma asked, Emma, where are you? Emma, thank you. How can students help contribute to a more tolerant atmosphere on campus on a larger scale than the individual? It's a great question. Actually, by the way, this isn't
Test
just,
1, 2, 3.
Oh, great.
this isn't just a question for these two, but also for the students themselves. So who would like to take a crack at that first?
Could you repeat it?
Let me do the question again. How can students help contribute to a more tolerant atmosphere on campus on a scale larger than just the individual?
I'll take a crack at it. I don't know oops, okay. I don't know how these things work. Obviously, I don't have all the answers, but I do think that one small way of just building a more tolerant atmosphere, especially just at Wayne State, is opening a dialogue about it, just like we're doing here, just having conversations, and maybe sometimes when one of your friends sends something intolerant, I know it's easy, like we said, like you can become tolerant of intolerance, but instead of that, maybe opening a dialogue about why they said that, and again, just really communicating about why tolerance is important, because I think a lot of the time, again, for young people, it's just something that just gets swept away because there's so many other important issues.
I would also add that we shouldn't discount the importance of the individual relationships as well. I think that one of the things that helps us build these kinds of bridges is to first build trust, and we do that in relationship. Sometimes when students ask me, should we have more dialogues like this? Should we have debate? Should we have panel discussions? And I say, you should have pizza. Because if you're against pizza, you're a moral monster. No, because I think that we were so quick to want to sort of air the differences and tackle this at some sort of big political level, when in fact it's by getting to know each other and building the relationships and building those connections that we really begin to understand what those differences are really about and are able to do some of the work that Robin talks about, at the political level of finding sort of win-win solutions there.
I think Ben had something.
So I will preface this with the fact that I did not attend Wayne State for undergrad, so I may use slightly different terminology, but I trust you can figure out the right office here. As far as how to make a difference on campus, if I'm thinking about this from the perspective of one student that wants to reach out and really make an impact bigger than just themselves, I'm thinking of events that we had at my undergrad that were basically all about diversity. It was about giving people a platform to share their cultures. And we had, I think it was an international studies office. It was basically where you went to talk about if you wanted to study abroad or something like that. And they also coordinated any students who were coming to our university from another country. And they worked with that office to basically reach out to people from different countries and have them help organize an event about their country. And it wasn't just like, here, let me talk to you. It was, here are some, examples of the food we eat, and we're gonna turn on our music for you and really show you this is what we enjoy. This is the parts that we're proud of about our culture, and they got to share that with the other students. And then on the flip side, I think, there may be things like that at Wayne State already, so you as a student can participate by going to those things and actually, getting the benefit of it. So.
The relevant office here is called OMSI, the Office of Multicultural Student Engagement.
Thanks.
We have other questions?
All right. I have a microphone. It can be
Great.
your microphone.
Keep the questions coming, by the way. We're going to randomly pick, and we'll read more off of the Twitter stream.
Sorry. I think I asked this on Twitter, but I didn't really clarify it really well. But this is a question for Dr. John Corvino. When you said that, you might have this baker who refuses to give a cake to a gay couple, what would you say on the flip side where an employer would fire an employee because they refuse to say to a Muslim that if they refuse to serve pork or alcohol, which is not like something that a Muslim can do, would it be justifiable for that employer to fire them under these grounds?
Can I talk about the law too?
Sure. Yeah. So Robin's going to talk a little bit about the law there, but I will say that we have something called BFOQs, bona fide occupational qualifications. Is that what you were going to talk about?
No.
Okay. So things that are actually relevant to a person's ability to do a job. So if I hire somebody to be a bus driver and then they tell me, oh, by the way, I'm Amish, so I can't drive, we've got a problem, right? In cases of people who are not able to do a portion of the job because they're unable to serve alcohol, let's say, or unable to serve pork or things like that, a lot's going to depend on relative hardship to the employer. A lot's going to vary, I think, based upon the size of the business, the ease with which they can switch out employees, the sort of fungibility. I mean, you've probably been at grocery stores where certain checkout lanes you can't buy alcohol because the person working at that checkout lane is under 21. So there are workarounds that can be done in those cases. And you're going to say a little bit, I think, about what some of the legal framework of that is?
Yeah, and then I don't know if you have things to add too, not to take from you, but just real quick. So, it's interesting. We've had since 1972 in Title VII, which is our federal employment non-discrimination law, a protection for people of religious belief or practice that generally says that every employer, unless they're put to the side for a specific reason, and some employers are, like religious employers themselves. I'll come back to that in a second. But even the government is an employer and has to reasonably accommodate a person's religious belief or practice up to a kind of, hardship on the employer. And that gets read under case law as a hardship to your coworkers too, not just the boss man, right? But if you think about it, that's an incredibly generous norm. It's saying that you should be able to work at a restaurant even if you can't serve alcohol, as long as there's somebody there that can serve alcohol and it's not a pain in everybody's backside, right? So it's an actual real way in which we try to be more inclusive. Those RFRAs, the federal and the state Religious Freedom Restoration Acts that I described on the map after the bumpy one, right? They are the same thing. Like, they got really trashed during Hobby Lobby, right? Because of the whole politics around, Hobby Lobby not wanting to provide contraceptive coverage to its employees. But generally, these statutes are about religious minorities, meaning they pay the biggest dividend to religious minorities. So anybody here from Kentucky, right? Do we have any folks been to Kentucky even? Nobody's even been to Kentucky. Okay, at least a few people have at least been to Kentucky, okay. It's interesting, they have a significant Amish population in Kentucky. And the Amish don't want to do things that are flashy. It's just not part of their faith tradition. And Kentucky authorities told the Amish, hey, you have to have this bright orange reflective triangle on the back of your buggy. Now, we can agree, people need to see the black buggy at night when it's pitch black. We all know you need to be able to see that. There's a compelling interest in making people have some sort of lighting. But it doesn't have to be an orange triangle. The Amish said that they'd put a lantern inside so people could see it. Or one of those Nike reflective kind of, gray reflective triangles. Could we not work with the Nike reflective triangle? And Kentucky authorities said no and threw nine Amish men in jail. Like, how dumb is that? Don't we have anything better to do than to throw 9 Amish people in jail when they're willing to have like a, Nike reflective triangle on the back? Answer, yes. But it took a Religious Freedom Restoration Act and state law to get to that outcome in Kentucky. Now, I think, what I love about the Title VII quote, accommodation for religious belief or practice is it is trying to let everybody be their whole self at work. And if you think about the claim that LGBT people have been making, they're saying we want to be completely ourselves, not just in private, but in public, in the workplace. Well, religious people, they're making the exact same claim, just from a different place. And I think that's one of the keys to this idea of civil rights complementarity, or protecting everybody. Did you guys have anything? Got one more thing.
So this may be deviating slightly from the original question, but in short, I would say, yes, I have no problem with treating it the same way and saying you do not have to. I think I'm comparing it to the distinction that Professor Corvino made, where it's you have a baker saying, I won't sell cakes to gay people specifically, or I won't sell this type of cake, period. And I think that's perfectly fine. And I think it's the same thing if you're talking about pork and alcohol. You're not isolating a specific category of people and saying, I will not give pork or alcohol to anybody except blah, blah, blah. And that's where I would have an issue with it. So to me, just saying this is a product that I will not provide, I don't see any issue with that.
I was going to do a follow-up, and Ben anticipated it for me, so thank you, Ben. I appreciate that.
More questions? I can read some from our Twitter feed. So this, I thought, is it Gauri's Veronica? Who is that? Thank you. So you've actually flipped us a lot of questions. I'm going to take one. So it says, if you're not exposed to all potential mindsets and ethnicities, there's a chance that there will be a stronger bias. How do you target those without firsthand experiences with diversity to not believe everything they hear from their limited community? That's a great question. So now John or some of you need to answer it. How do you do that?
Well, I think the beginning of it is recognizing that we all have limited perspectives, right? Even living in a city, even coming to a place like Wayne State, which is remarkably diverse as campuses go, and this is something I notice, because like Robin, I travel around to a lot of different campuses, and sometimes I get to campuses and it's like, whoa, this is not a diverse place at all. And then I come back home to Wayne State, and yes, we have a lot of diversity here, but that doesn't mean that we're exposed to all actual or possible perspectives. So I think approaching things with a kind of humility, recognizing that we all have more to learn, being willing to listen, being willing to pause, being willing to ask questions, that's all an important part of that.
I'll just add one thing. So I think just getting out and being involved with people, it's sort of, as John said, in relationship. I went to see, just for whatever reason, I just stumbled into an LGBTQ event where we had a drag queen. It's actually, one of the folks who has been on like reality TV, and I'm in such a cultural fog, I didn't even know it was a thing. But then, not drag queens, but like that there was a reality TV show. But in any event, and I was really struck by how many students on my campus didn't feel like they had a place. And it wasn't my issue necessarily, but the idea that you could feel like you don't have a place, isn't that everybody's issue? And I think sometimes trying to get to a place where we have like a real empathy or understanding, is crucial. And I think that just comes from being involved with people. I really do.
So the question was...
here? Okay. Yeah, you keep going.
Okay. The question was, if I understand correctly, I can't be exposed to every community, so how can I avoid sort of making these negative assumptions about them without being exposed to them? And I think that one way that I try to do that is to think about examples of communities that I have gained exposure to. And pretty much any community, there's some sort of surprise that I didn't know or that defies a stereotype. And I just think about that. And then if I am thinking about this other group and I catch myself like making these assumptions, but I'm like, I've never met someone from this country. I just try to reel myself back to like, you remember that last time you thought this one thing about people from this country? Well, you were wrong. So maybe you should question your assumptions. And I try to sort of counter my own biases. Sure.
Like you just said, like how do we get more people to think like that? Because I know a lot of people, they like are protective and they just take that measure, like, oh, I heard they do this, so I'm just not going to talk to them. I'm going to avoid that table because they don't seem friendly. Just that kind of thing.
I think that's a hard question. I think, things like this event that's sort of the purpose is, trying to inspire a wider audience to take those steps. On an individual level, I think that things like, Laura mentioned sort of countering things that your friends say that you may realize are not necessarily accurate. Yeah, that is a difficult question. I admit that, but it's, having conversations to reiterate that importance and show other people the benefits of it, because nobody wants to just be, sort of beaten into going along with what you think, but you show them, hey, here's something really cool that you're missing out on because you're closing your mind to it.
So I think we have one more. This is a great question, obviously, because everybody has something.
Again, don't have like the full answer, and not everybody is going to respond to what I say, the same way. But I think a really important part is just, first of all, building community and providing forums where people can interact of different, whether you're from different places, different religions, etc. And I think just like it doesn't always necessarily need to be like those two people like intentionally like, oh, I want to go out and I like want to find, I don't know, like you don't have to intentionally be looking for diversity or be looking for those places. As long as you go to a place that does have diversity, you're able to have, like, people will be able to have interactions with other people that maybe do have opposing views, and they'll grow to like build a dialogue or enjoy them, and they won't even know the difference in some cases, obviously. And I just think, again, like providing platforms for people to have conversations is helpful.
I think we had a question here.
Hi, this isn't really a question, but it's, I just want to share something that I went through. So I was watching Book TV, and I was watching Eric Metaxas, and he had written a book on Friedrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of my heroes. And I was just really so excited. I was really getting into the conversation. So after it was over, I went online to look up a little more about him. I had forgotten that I did know a little about him. And I find that he's like notorious for being anti-choice. And he appears at, rallies and so forth.
Metaxas, not
Metaxas,
Bonhoeffer. Thank you.
Oh, yes, sorry about that. So anyway, it just made me think about, well, wait a minute, I loved him a minute ago, and now that I know he feels this way about it, so what, so anyway, it just made me have to go through some thinking about my possible intolerance.
Thank you for sharing that.
Can I say something about Bonhoeffer? Because he's one of the most inspiring people. Would you prefer to say something about Bonhoeffer?
Sure.
Okay, you may be a scholar of Bonhoeffer for all I know, but
I do know Eric Metaxas.
yeah. Here, yes, speak, yeah.
I do know Eric personally, only because I went to church with him, and for a little Jewish girl to go to church is a big deal right there. So I do know about Bonhoeffer, and I have taught Bible studies about it. So I'm kind of like a klutz. I just drop all my notes. But I really loved this forum. This forum is just awesome.
Thank you.
Really rocking. There are a couple of things that I've been mulling over about cake wars, for example, is the social interaction theory, where symbols are so important. They're so much larger than even the thing itself, so we hold things very dear that are the symbols. And then this whole conflict mediation or conflict resolution is, I also had a comment, so apparently it's going to take me a minute. about living in our information bubbles. I learned that from Dr. Ronald Brown in PS 1010, that if we can have the courage to break out of our information bubbles with exposure therapy, that's usually what they do in psychiatry or psychology, is that if you have a phobia or whatever, you keep exposing yourself to that, and eventually you become inured to the things that rattle you. That's the idea. But what I really enjoyed about this is the pointing toward common ground, finding common ground, those areas where we do live next door to each other and we are affected by the same, hurricane, or affected by the same, 9/11 or whatever it was. And that at some point we do need to unify, and the things that make us different are really less important than the things that put us on the same side of the fence. And I guess the last thing I wanted to share about what my takeaway is that our ethnocentricity is that somehow we think our way is the best way. Although I love Eric Metaxas, and he's an amazing human being. He also did all the Veggie Tales and things like that. He's a children's book writer and darling. But to be able to see how other people live, like indigenous peoples, we're finding now, like with green needing to look at our earth from a green perspective. Well, had we gone and not stuffed Native Americans into boarding schools and whatever, we might have gotten a little further ahead of this. We have a lot to learn from one another, and by willing to take what we know and what we think we know for a moment and just kind of let that go to make a little room for something new to come in, that's a really good start. I mean, I have found this, I'm probably older than a lot of people here, so that's how I figured that out. But that the things that helped us maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago in knowledge may be outdated, and there might be something new to learn from something that's even older than that. So that was all I really wanted to share about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elle. I want to pick up on one thing that you said, because you talked about the value of finding common ground, and I want to give props to my friend and colleague, Robin Fretwell Wilson, because Robin is not only an amazing scholar on these issues, she is someone who has worked really hard behind the scenes and really effectively behind the scenes in bringing people together, bringing together legislators from different sides of the aisle. She talked about the Utah thing. It's like, oh, isn't that cool what happened in Utah? Well, the thing happened in Utah because of Robin and people like her working in places like Utah. So I really just want to express my appreciation for the very practical work that she does, which often, again, is behind the scenes so people don't see it and recognize it.
Thank you. That's nice, and I really appreciate that. I want to say something that echoes your essay, Ben, really, but this whole conversation about goodwill and courage. How many of you have had some sort of little inkling, just when you've talked to somebody, you've said something that struck you as a little bit hateful, but you weren't sure you'd heard it before? Right? We've all had that. And it takes tremendous courage to say something or to show a different way. And I think sometimes we hear things that people say that are spoken from the heart, that are spoken from a place of faith, because they've inherited a certain types of belief, they've been taught a way. And they don't mean it hatefully, but it sounds hateful. And I think sometimes to ask folks why did you say that particular thing, is a really person by person, retail, not wholesale way to change people's minds. And we hear all the time we should be allies, right? We have to be allies to LGBT folk for sure, because we're mean to people still. Spend some time with some trans folks. We are mean to people. we are for sure mean. Anybody who tells you that we're over LGBT discrimination and like the world has all solved it, they don't know these folks. They don't know. But on the same side of that, we sometimes are mean to religious people. Like, look at the Amish just getting tossed in jail for no good reason in Kentucky. So I think sometimes what I talk about my work is doing with people is trying to draw out those threads and their own commitments that make them allies. So you think about the evangelical, who might not want to make a cake or might not want to place a child with the first family that becomes available. And oftentimes I'll say, I just don't get that. Like, I don't see Jesus being behind, the idea that anybody doesn't have a place to live or a way to make a living. And that's a very theological claim. Now, if there's an answer for that, we can have a conversation about it. And there may be. But I think we have to genuinely, honestly, in good faith, try to understand where the other person's coming from. And a lot of times you see them move and grow, and it's really stunning. We got questions over here. Did you all want to add anything? Okay.
Mine is fine. That was kind of like me. I kind of wanted to add to what she said and also what you said. Another way to sort of bring about like diversity and explaining something is for you yourself to explain something to someone else. Like there was a person in my class, they identify as they, and they recently just, I was talking to them and they recently gave me a survey that from the National Database about trans people. And so after reading that, I understood a lot more about what certain challenges and obstacles that trans people face every single day. And that helped me understand the whole movement as a whole. And I think that, like, as a Muslim or as an Arab or as anything that you identify as, if you can have a conversation with someone else and introduce them to it, you're also kind of joining the dialogue and deciding that you're going to build tolerance and not so much just leave it up to them to research it. You can introduce it to them.
That's a great point. We got questions all over.
Hey, congratulate you two again on winning those essay competitions. So I am a 43, soon to be 44-year-old white male from Alabama, retired military, and you would probably draw a lot of conclusions about how I think and who I am based on that. You might be wrong. Unlike Ben, I grew up in the church, and now I'm very much probably where he was not too long ago. I struggle internally with tolerance because I don't have a lot of tolerance for what I perceive based on my own life experiences as something that's hateful. But I try to reel that in and remember where I was not so long ago. I ran an event center, did weddings and things of that nature in Alabama a few years back, and I had somebody come in and view the venue. And this is Northwest Alabama. It's heavily Church of Christ. And he looks at me and said, "I hate to ask you, but I'm gay. Will you rent this facility to me?" And I didn't miss a beat. I said, "What color is your money?" And he said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Is the money in your wallet green?" And just like the weight that I literally saw raise off this person's shoulder, it'll almost bring me to tears right now. But when we talk about, let's talk about organized religion and doctrine and the pace at which that changes and the age at which that becomes instilled in people. It seems like a long road. What are your thoughts on what we can do to accelerate it if we can?
Can I make a pitch for these dialogues? Do you know why we do these dialogues? Because of them. They get it. They absolutely get it. I often say to people, if we could just distill their insights, which is what their essays are doing, and then ship them around to all the adults, we would just be a better place. And I mean that. So the biggest single thing we can do is elevate the voices of our students, because they have grown up with unprecedented diversity. And you can just hear it here. And I know it's like a selection bias because you don't come to the dialogue unless you're sort of interested in the dialogue. I get that. But I still think that, you know, millennials and Gen Z have the most at stake. I think they have the most insight to how we practically navigate these things, and we need to give them a national megaphone.
You know, when you were talking about the early influences, I started thinking about the double-edged sword of the internet. And I'm older than you, I'm 50, and I remember a world where we didn't have that. And on the one hand, you know, for me as a gay man, you know, coming out at a time, look, I grew up in New York, and then I went to graduate school in Austin, Texas, so I lived in urban areas. But I thought to myself, you know, for people who felt isolated in rural areas with smaller communities, with smaller populations, where they really didn't feel like there were people around them who were like themselves and so on, the kind of connectivity we have with things like the internet, what a great advantage and a boon that is. And then, of course, the flip side of that is it's also easy for a lot of really bad, really awful, really hateful information to spread. And we have to be really careful about how we use that tool and use that tool in a positive way, because the potential for abuse and the potential for just getting a really bad diet of that is real. I continue to think that Wayne State is a place where we have such an opportunity to help create a better dialogue here that we can spread out into the world, because we're diverse, but not just diverse. We are also a place where I think diverse groups of people have learned how to coexist pretty well, and have learned how to interact pretty well. I mean, yes, I mean, people tend to form groups, and sometimes those groups don't always interact with other groups, but that happens here, and it happens here more than most places. And if we could figure out a way to model that for the larger community in Metro Detroit and beyond, maybe that can then have that trickle-down effect to affect, you know, young people and so on issues of religion and various other issues as well.
So I'm going to answer this from a weird perspective. My undergrad degree was political science, and the focus of my study was mainly on like revolutionary theory. So I'm going to refer to someone named Antonio Gramsci. He's largely known for like communist writing, but I think that he's, in my opinion, more valuable to look to in terms of how to achieve social change, whatever your end goal is. And the analogy that he uses throughout most of his writing is that he talks about things as a trench war. So you have to take the territory one trench at a time. And each of those trenches is something like a newspaper or Boy Scouts or a club, right? So you have all these different angles that society interacts with each other, and that people choose their own groups. And as far as how to speed up the process of affecting change, go through as many of those trenches as you can. So, you know, this is one trench, if you will. We have a university, we're having a dialogue. Another trench would be, you have somebody who's starting a newspaper online, or somebody who's hosting a podcast, and like, that's great. But as you mentioned, you know, people are this big when these things get indoctrinated into them. So I think a lot of the things like that are, you talk about, you know, what is your daycare teaching? What are the values that they show? What is your, you know, your church Bible study? What are the passages that they pull out, and how do they break them down? So when I talked about having more of a positive experience with religion, there's like one family in particular that really stands out to me as proving to me that not all religious people are the same. And they had a daughter who came out as a lesbian, and they really struggled with that because their church was not accepting. So they left their church, and they found a church that was accepting, and then they brought more people with them. So they are changing sort of the body of this hateful church. They're taking away from that and bringing these people and their families and their children to this church that is teaching far more accepting values. And I think that examples like that, they seem hard, but really I don't think they're that hard. I think it's just recognizing that those changes make a difference, right? Like, they are prominent in their community, and they have had an impact in changing the dialogue and changing the atmosphere. And that's just one example. I think you can do that in a lot of different ways, but I think you're correct that the younger people are, the more receptive they are to these changes or to staying the same and staying, with these negative views. So I just think trying to take as many approaches as you can is great.
Hello? Okay. I was just going to ask, as an LGBTQ person, why should we be invested in the legal system or legality when it seems like it just ends up being us being subjected to violence by justices, by lack of nuance, by our problems being reduced to these things such as bathrooms or cakes?
Well, I appreciate your point about the reduction of our problems to bathrooms or cakes, and particularly, cakes, because it's just cake. I mean, bathrooms don't diminish how that actually affects people's lives, and particularly trans people's lives. If you're ever out in public and you need to use the restroom and you can't find a restroom where you're safe or comfortable, that's a serious issue, a lot more serious than not getting the cake from the baker that you want. But I would say that the progress on these issues has been real and important. As somebody who remembers not just a time where I was not able to legally marry my partner, but a time where I was an unapprehended felon in the state of Texas because of sodomy laws, where it was actually against the law for me to be sexually affectionate with the person that I loved, and where I didn't necessarily live in fear that the police were going to come knocking on my door about that, but that fact made it very hard for people like me to go into jobs in public service and police, and so any kind of thing where the fact that you had this hidden crime. I mean, if I wanted to adopt, for example, right. all kinds of things where that limited access. So, yeah, fighting those battles can be very, very painful, and I wouldn't advise that anybody do it if it's too hard a road for them individually. But I'm also very grateful to all the people who came before me and all the people who worked alongside me to make some of those legal changes, and who continue to work to make legal changes so that people can live safely, live freely, can flourish in public life.
You go first.
So you asked why you should embrace the legal system, is that correct?
Or just be invested.
Invested, I'm sorry, wrong word. So that made me think of an example that I remember from constitutional law that really stood out to me, and I think there's a similar analogy for LGBT issues. You have this whole body of law for the early stages of our history talking about property rights, and that is very different than it sounds. Today, we have, for one example, you can think of minimum wage laws, and that seems like, well, duh, you have minimum wage laws, right? And what was really interesting to me is that the argument that gave us minimum wage laws was for a long time used against things like minimum wage laws. People were supposedly, my constitutional right to property gave me a constitutional right to enter a contract for whatever I wanted. So if I wanted to work for 15 cents an hour, that was my constitutional right, and setting a minimum wage law violated that. And then eventually you had some clever lawyer, I don't remember who it was, but someone came along and they turned that argument on its head and persuaded people, and I have a property right that guarantees me a fair wage, right? And that's sort of the basis. And it's a lot more complicated, but that's sort of the gist of it. And I think right now we see something very similar where people are turning things on their head in favor of LGBT people. You have this very long established sex discrimination, that you cannot treat a man and a woman differently. And more recently, people have been arguing on LGBT issues, rather than focusing on the sexuality, they focus on the sex and the discrimination by sex. So they say, me as a man, I can marry a woman. So a woman who is in my shoes cannot do the same action that I can do, so she is being discriminated against for her sex. And I think that arguments like that can be really powerful and they can have a big impact, but you have to be invested in the law, right? Like, I don't think you have to be invested in the law as it stands today. You can, all these things that you pointed out are issues with the law, right? You do not see laws today giving LGBT people the treatment that you and I think they deserve. But in order to make those changes, you have to look at the law and say, this is the problem. This is how I can persuade people that it should be different. So that would be my answer.
So let me just try are we closing up soon, do you think? Okay, well, first I want to announce our winner, if that's okay. It's Emma. And so thank you for a constant stream of questions. I appreciate that very much. On this point, let me just say, I think you should be invested because you matter. You know, look at you talked about hateful things like the bathroom bills, okay? They were predicated on a false narrative that somehow trans people were more dangerous than other people. And they in particular, there were 2 affidavits filed in connection with North Carolina's bathroom bill when North Carolina was still trying to defend it. And I deconstruct them, literally, those affidavits, paragraph by paragraph, in an article called The Nonsense About Bathrooms. Now you can imagine how I came out. It's a nonsense claim. It just didn't have factual support. But for lots of people who don't have other folks in their lives to share that information with them or to challenge it, they would just take it as, oh yeah, okay, so North Carolina said that, that's true. So you should be invested because you can read an affidavit as well as I can. You can go look at the research that underlies this as well as I can. So that's one reason to be invested. Second reason to be invested is, frankly, the legislature is accountable to you. You're a voter. They work for you. We forget that. Because, you know, they're all like wealthy and they seem elite and da-da-da-da. They have no job but for you. So remind them of that. Go see them and tell them, I read these studies and I can tell you that this is garbage. And here they are. If you need a shorthand appendix of these things, go download my paper from my webpage, robinfretwellwilson.org, and it'll be right there for you. You know, the third reason is, I just think about the people who have, in the span of a lifetime, exerted such incredible change. Think about my co-author, Bill Eskridge. He tells this really raucously funny story, but it's not funny, about how he was denied tenure at the University of Virginia, where I went to law school, long before I was there. Where did he end up? At Yale. And he's probably the best LGBT rights scholar, legal scholar in the country. And he not only was he able to travel that distance, but he changed the law so that it shouldn't matter anymore. John has been a hero, absolute hero. You know, with lots and lots, I met you because my students at Washington and Lee, when I taught there, told me he was coming. That's how much of a difference that he made before I was even aware of him. And Shannon Minter, a trans man who has been my dialogue partner in dialogues like this all over the country, brought some of the same-sex marriage cases that ultimately wound up at the Supreme Court, has been fighting the ban on trans people in the military, has been fighting the ban under the Affordable Care Act, or, you know, the claims under the Affordable Care Act that you shouldn't have to do services for LGBT people, even if you would do them for other people, right? Every one of those folks are heroes, and they made a difference. That's the reason you should be invested, because somebody will be saying this about you.
We need to wrap up time-wise. Do we have one quick more? Sure. Yeah.
About 25 years ago, I went to Provincetown, and it happened to be, I did not know this when I went, but it was Transgender and Transvestite Week. And the place we stayed was a bed and breakfast, and so everyone else there was transgendered or transvestite. And I just gained so much empathy from spending that time with them and getting to know them and learning how they, like, you can't go into stores and try on clothes, and they have no one to teach them how to put makeup on. And one guy was an airline mechanic who lost his job because he felt he was a woman. And just getting to know people and talking to them, and you just gain so much empathy for them, and it's just invaluable to have conversations with people and to talk to them. And to see young people nowadays be so accepting of people that are transgendered and transvestite and gay, and I just bless the young people. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, it's a great note to end on.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you all for coming to this, and in particular,
Emma, you have to come see
what, we're going to...
Yeah, I already announced it.
We
Emma's
already
going
announced
to
it.
come see me.
Emma is
yes.
going to come see Robin afterwards. I want to once again congratulate our student essay winners, and in particular thank my friend Robin Fretwell Wilson, our moderator,
Thanks,
Christopher
Chris.
Lund, and all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was super positive. Emma, it was a very positive. It was wonderful. My pen died, however. So my pen died.